Welcome back to Green Thumb Gardening Secrets. Today we're going to talk about 20 reasons why to grow cover crops. Let's get going. First, let's talk about what. Cover crops, as you see here,
are crops like these thick stands of oats, forage radishes with super deep tap roots, this winter wheat that grew up after the forage radishes died back over the winter, beautiful cereal rye, which is also called winter rye, beginner-friendly annual ryegrass, crimson clover and other clovers that are shorter-term legumes, perennial legumes like alfalfa with their massive tap roots, and many others that,
just like the name implies, cover the soil. They blanket the soil, they protect the soil. When the soil would otherwise be bare in areas of the garden where there aren't food crops or between widely spaced food crops. They're also an acknowledgement that we can do better, and there's a better option than leaving our soil bare for 6 to 9 months of the year.
But why grow them? There are at least 20 fantastic reasons, and all are super important for both our gardens and farms.
Our 20 reasons fit into 5 or 6 major groupings. Our first 5 reasons have to do with nutrients. Number 1, cover crops capture nutrients. Our water-soluble nutrients like nitrogen, potassium, and calcium, especially nitrogen, leach down through the soil with water. Being water-soluble, they just filter right down in through the soil when it rains. And cover crops, especially grasses, and especially ones like winter rye, are outstanding at capturing those nutrients before they leach down into the soil. And cover crops capture them, hold them in their tissues while they're growing, and then release them back to our plants when they decay. Winter rye actually, in some studies, has been found to capture 100% of the available nitrogen. Cover crops also produce nutrients. Let's go over here to look at some legumes. Here we have some clover, crimson clover, and here we have some alfalfa. Right here we have one of both right next to each other. Both of these are legumes. And as legumes, they have little nodules in their roots that house rhizobium bacteria. And rhizobium bacteria take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, but the nitrogen in our atmosphere is not in the form that plants can use. The rhizobium bacteria actually take through little pore spaces in the soil, get access to that nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it into a form that plants can use. So number 2, produce nutrients. I'm hearing some winter wheat, which also had some forage radishes, also called tillage radishes, that died out in the winter. And the winter wheat kind of came in and took its place. Those forage radishes have really long tap roots. And cover crops that have really long tap roots like forage radishes, alfalfa, and other deeply rooted cover crops go down deeper than our typical garden plant roots, and they pull deeper nutrients up from farther in the soil than our garden plant's roots can reach. And then once they die, leave them in the area of the soil where our garden plant's roots can again reach them. Some, like buckwheat, actually have little acids that secrete acids that dissolve certain soil macronutrients into a form that is readily usable for plants. Mycorrhizal fungi do those same thing in combination with the roots of cover crops, dissolve a lot of nutrients that are otherwise hard for our plants to use and put them into forms that are perfectly usable for our plants. So they make nutrients more available by getting them from deeper in the soil and by putting them in forms that are more usable for our plants. Fourth reason, they add organic matter and fertility. And from their live forms here to their dead forms here and all of their roots underneath, they add a large amount of organic matter to our soil, which is the core of soil health. Organic matter decays into the perfect nutrient balance for our plants. Each 1% of organic matter, for example, gets broken down by soil microbes to 20 to 40 pounds of nitrogen per year, each 1%. And it's a slow release of these nutrients in exactly the forms our plants need. It's not something that's dissolved and gone and flows away in the dissolution of a pellet. And cover crops are the next best way to add organic matter after using cured compost. Like the oats I have here that are now dead and decaying into the soil. Number 5, Cover crops provide homegrown mulch and compost material. All cover crops used to protect otherwise bare soil between our main crops can provide some mulch and compost material, but specific kinds like alfalfa and sorghum Sudan grass hybrids can be grown on a fraction of the garden during the main growing season to provide huge volumes of both. It's common, for example, to get 3 or 4 cuttings of alfalfa during the growing season, and sorghum Sudan grass hybrids are typically mowed when they reach 3 or 4 feet tall to spur the denser, deeper root systems that greatly improve our soil. Cuttings from these 2 cover crops add tremendous volume to compost piles and provide them with a fantastic source of green, high nitrogen materials. For us, this practice has greatly increased the amount and quality of cured compost we produce. However, these fantastic cuttings can also be used as super nutrient-rich, weed-free mulch. Similarly, the dead and dried stalks from winter-killed covers like these winter-killed oats here can be left on the soil to decay while you plant amongst them, or raked off before you plant, set aside, and added back to help cover the soil later. Either way, they provide an excellent source of homegrown mulch. And if you're planting a crop that provides its own mulch from its foliage, like bush beans and winter squash, you can remove the dried stalks for good and simply add them to the compost pile, providing a great source of brown, high carbon materials. If you have too much at one time, just pile them nearby to be safe for times like summer when the compost pile needs some layers of dried, high carbon materials to balance out the overwhelming amount of green, high nitrogen materials we all tend to get that time of year. Either way, they're a great source of homegrown compost materials as well. And the homegrown nature of both means we know whether or not they're doused in chemicals that would be harmful to our main crops or filled with weed seeds that would become a headache. And most importantly, it means we're putting our garden to work and growing its own fertility. Our next major grouping of reasons has to do with air and water. Cover crops protect against compaction and erosion. Let's look at some bare soil. As water hits bare soil, you can imagine it here. I mean, how heavy is a water droplet? You can imagine water hitting and water droplets hitting. As water comes and hits, imagine pouring BBs onto soil. Every single drop hits with such force, it can splash water up to 6 feet in every direction, or splash soil up to 6 feet in every direction. And think of that weight just for compaction. It's like a multitude of millions of tiny BBs being poured on your soil. After just a little bit, you'll see compacted soil where it forms it's so compacted, you see this, it's like a crust on top just from compaction. This is compacted soil on top. I just pulled it off here's spots even through the cover crop. These little compacted, and over the season, it will make this entire area, if it's bare, and over the off season too, more like cement than soil. Let me see if I can find an area that is, here you go. You can actually see the divots in the soil from water, just in the space between the oats. That's with some cover crop on. You can see right here, same thing, some erosion in what's left. Just even with the cover crop on, you see that. Imagine that is completely bare soil. And once that soil gets sprayed apart, it becomes much more susceptible to erosion. And then also water on bare soil flows very quickly, and the faster it flows, the more it can carry. Water flowing fast enough can carry boulders. It definitely can carry our soil away. And what's worse, we lose our topsoil. We don't lose our subsoil that's 6 inches or a foot or 2 feet down, some places maybe even 4 feet down. We lose our topsoil first, which has our richest, most organically rich soil, richest in organic matter, richest in nutrients. So cover crops, what they do instead, imagine rain hitting this area here. It's so dense. Think of this, it hitting here, it has to go in. It doesn't hit soil. It hits all of these stems and all of these leaves and all of the stubble underneath. And so it goes down to the soil in gentle trickles and drips. And once it gets down to the soil, so it doesn't compact it. And then once it gets down to the soil, it slowly, all the stubbles and all these little stems, the water sheet flow over the surface. And so the water's going so slow, it just can't pick up as much soil to erode it. So it protects our soil against compaction and erosion. Even more, it actually loosens our soil. So think of all of these roots and all the earthworms, beetles, etc., that these cover crops provide habitat for. As the roots and the earthworms and the beetles, etc., make their way through the soil, they gently nudge it upward and loosen it. You walk in soil, and I don't recommend walking in and trampling it, but if you do take a step into it, you can tell it's entirely different than bare soil. It's spongy and you'll sink into it. It's a wonderfully loosened soil. The third reason having to do with water and air, and the eighth reason overall, it increases air and water infiltration. Water flowing more slowly over the surface is more likely to go down into the soil. You can see sometimes if on bare soil, if you pour water on it, it just will sheet right off the surface. If you dig down a little bit, it's just completely dry. But water that moves slowly over the surface has much greater chance to seep down into the soil. Also, all of the decaying roots, the earthworm holes, the beetle holes, they create all these macropores in the soil that also increase air and water infiltration in the soil. And air infiltration is super important in our soil. The third way that increases air and water infiltration has to do with something called glomalin. So let me grab some soil here that came out of a different part of our yard. And it came in here on a tarp, and let me grab a little bit of it's in amongst these leaves. This soil, this is a chunk that fell off a tarp that we had up here. And you can see there's not a lot of organic matter in it. And the soil is more, it's not sand, it's soil, but it functions more like sand on a beach. And let's go over and take a handful of this and compare it to good soil. And let me actually also come down here and get another handful of really good soil. It's another good spot of the garden here. Get a handful of good soil. Now, this isn't our absolutely best soil, but it's much better than this. This soil that functions more like sand, it doesn't have a lot of glomalin. Even if I made this moist, it would do the same thing it's doing now. The only pore spaces it has in there are what's in between the particles as they settle together. They're just regularly sized particles and they just settle together. And it just crumbles in your fingers and falls through. And if you had to get it wet, it wouldn't even do much. This isn't doing this just because it's wet, although that is part of keeping everything in there healthy. Crumbled, the spaces in this soil, I crumble this, and it comes into these irregularly sized particles. And actually, you can see some of the organic life in it right there. Something you can actually see. Those larger, irregularly sized particles make for much bigger pore space. And what glues them into those larger irregularly sized particles is something called glomalin. And glomalin is produced by the mycorrhiza, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that live in partner with so many of our garden plants, so many of our plants in general live in conjunction with their roots. And the little hyphae of the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are coated with glomalin. And it functions to protect them and their relationships and their really beneficial symbiotic relationships with all of our plants. And it also glues the soil together. After it's done its job of protecting the hyphae, it will last in the soil for 40 years or more. That is the key. These soil aggregates are the key to making healthy soil. So even after the mycorrhizal fungi are done, they leave us with glomalin that gives us the aggregates that make super healthy soil. It's part of the organic matter that it's in super healthy soil. The ninth reason overall, the fourth reason, the water and air, is it increases water holding capacity. Larger irregularly shaped particles make larger irregularly shaped pores that are just much bigger. So there's just so much more space in the soil for water to absorb into. So that slowly moving water of the soil has a place to go. 50% of the volume of a soil in healthy soil is pore space. In unhealthy soil and compacted soil, it's still 30%, which is amazingly large. But in healthy soil, it's 50%. So the more we can foster that, the better it is. And anybody who's ever looked at their soil knows what healthy soil looks like, this is kind of explaining, oh, that's why. It has these good aggregate structure with lots of organic matter. A lot of that is glomalin that gives us pore space in our soil, nice and loose and friable. Plus, organic matter itself, this organic matter, as it decays and stays in the soil and becomes humus, organic matter in the soil can hold almost its weight in water. So cover crops help increase soil's water holding capacity. So this isn't a good example anymore because these are dead. Let me go over to the other side. So cover crops, and yes, they are using some of the soil moisture. Not only are they, because of increased water infiltration and increased pore space, having a lot more water in the soil to begin with. And you can see if this is very perfectly moist soil under here, if you could take a look at it. But the shade that they provide, even after they die, like over on that other bed, the shade that they provides a living mulch that vastly decreases the amount of evaporation that's happening in the soil and keeps our soil nice and evenly moist. You can see under your plants' foliage in your garden how they shade the soil and it keeps the soil moist. Soil that is directly hit by the sun's rays evaporates at an amazing rate, and keeping it shaded keeps that soil nice and evenly moist, protecting that water to seep down in and be there and ready as a supply for our plants when we garden. Finally, for water and air, the 6th reason for water and air, the 11th reason overall, cover crops decrease runoff. We can see how it's slowing the water down. Because they decrease the amount of runoff, they vastly increase our water quality. That's soil running off, and you see silt-laden streams, bad for trout, bad for all sorts of aquatic life. Fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides that kill some aquatic life and also foster other aquatic life, which further degrades, algae blooms and you name it, that further degrades aquatic habitats. So the final reasons for air and water is that it increases our water quality. Reasons number 12 and 13 have to do with yields and cost. Cover crops, because they capture so many nutrients, because they build nutrients, because they pull nutrients up from deeper in the soil, they boost our yields. They keep nutrients in the soil at exactly the way our plants want them and in an area that the plant's roots can get, which drastically boosts our yields. And it does so much cheaper than using fertilizer or having to use more fertilizer. You can seed in an entire garden for a few dollars. It's embarrassing. I go to my local garden shop to get cover crops, and I always have to keep cash on me because I walk up and it cost me $1 to get what I'll use for that day. And I feel bad buying only $1 worth of stuff there, and definitely using credit card, right? So they provide all these benefits, but they're really cheap to provide those benefits. Reasons 14 and 15 have to do with weeds, diseases, and pests. If you think about what we had growing in any spot in this garden before this and what we'll have growing after, as long as this cover crop is from a different plant family, it doesn't have the same diseases and pests. So say we had squash growing here and we pulled the squash off in the fall and we planted a cover crop. As long as the cover crop is not from the squash family, it's not a cucurbit, it doesn't have the same diseases and pests. And so it breaks those disease and pest cycles. The disease doesn't have anything to live on. Those diseases live on cucurbits, they don't live on grasses. And the pests live on cucurbits, they don't live on grasses in general. So having a cover crop in between garden plants can break disease and pest cycles. They can also really vastly prevent and discourage weeds. Have a look through this bed over here. We came through earlier and I walked through, I found one weed, and this is bare, but here we go, here are a couple. Here are a couple little weeds. They're not even bad. They're actually little legumes that we wouldn't mind in here anyway, especially at this stage. And this is bad in comparison to what I'll show you in a second, because this is bare in comparison to that for reasons I'll explain in another video. But we have very few weeds. If we come over to this bed, which has a living cover crop, you can see, you just pan the camera through, we have basically no weeds. Oh yeah, here we go. Here's one. And this is a good example here in this tiny little spot. One of the things that's amazing about weeds, why they're so successful in our garden, one of their major adaptive qualities is dormancy in their seeds. Their seeds have an ability to stay dormant until just the perfect time for them to have the best chance of survival. If you think about it, if our weed seeds germinated at any time of the year, we'd quickly exhaust the seed bank. but they don't. They know exactly the right temperature, soil moisture, amount of sunlight. For every seed, it's different. And what cover crops do is they shade the soil because they keep the soil shaded, cooler, and more full of moisture. Most seeds don't germinate. They just don't think it's the right time for them. They can tell that they don't have an open enough place to germinate. And those that do end up so stunted that this is what the weed that you have. The cover crop is so dense, it just outcompetes the weed. And to be honest, a couple of those were Dutch clover that I would have just left on there because it's actually doing some good. It's not doing any harm. It's another cover crop that we've brought in here, so it's not really a weed even. The last 5 reasons have to do with more health and peace of mind. The first 15 apply to everybody, every gardener, every farmer. The last 5 maybe only apply to organic and old school organic or people who are trying to use this kind of system of gardening. First of all, cover crops, as you can see, give you a way to have fertility and garden health, including lack of insects, they're one part of a system that allows you to do that without any chemicals at all. In fact, you can do it without even any organic fertilizers, foliar application, or inputs. This gives a systematic approach that creates optimal soil health and then optimal plant health rather than fighting symptoms of lack of health. Reason number 18, cover crops provide homes and possibly food for beneficial insects, arachnids, birds, amphibians, and mammals. They provide habitat. They provide the nooks and crannies to hide, hunt, sleep, and eat. Love it when we see toads in the garden. I love it when I walk around the garden and I see a garden full of spiders, sow bugs, millipedes, stag beetles. So they provide the nooks and crannies to hide, to hunt, sleep, and eat that our beneficials need. And some cover crops like buckwheat even provide food in their nectar to attract beneficial insects to our gardens. Number 19, cover crops protect soil from temperature extremes. Most of the beneficial organisms in our garden, from the microorganisms that build healthy soil to stag beetles and earthworms and everything in between, they can't take the huge temperature fluctuations that you see imagine the soil are bare here and it is baked in the sun and we have 25 degrees at night, but it gets 70 during the day, which is not uncommon at certain times of the year. And those massive temperature fluctuations are really hard on soil life, all sorts of soil life. And cover crops provide this layer of protection to insulate that, just like a blanket, just like a cover, that gives the soil a steadier temperature over time, and it's slow temperature swings that are much more beneficial for everything in the soil. Finally, number 20, cover crops give you a solid next step. All of us, I know we've been guilty of this, will sometimes leave plant debris, leave the remaining stubble, and even the remaining plants of our garden plants in long after we've harvested the usable part. Maybe we leave the corn stalks up long after we've harvested the corn, or we leave the squash vines long after it's providing much squash, or we leave the bean plants long after we've harvested most of the crop of beans and there's really nothing much coming left. But if we think about this, we're leaving them up there and all they're doing is giving a greater amount of time for the pests that live on them and the diseases that grow on them to continue to grow. It's better for us to take them out, put them in the compost bin, and grow soil. Why would we do something like that? Why would we work against ourselves in that way? I don't think it's laziness. I think part of us a lot of times thinks to ourselves, well, it's better than nothing, and we're right. So cover crops give us a solid next step so we can take that garden debris that's no longer growing anything that we're using, put it in the compost bin to grow soil, and then we can put on cover crops that are going to be a much denser version of that. And instead of growing food for us, they're growing food for our soil during our off season. So when we have that solid next step, it's much more likely we're going to take it right at the time that we should. So those are 20 reasons. And to be honest, I could give more. I could say it allows you to create fertility in a way that doesn't kill your soil microbiome. All the microorganisms in our soil, if we constantly put fertilizer on them, those salts and the fertilizers are going to build up and make it inhospitable, if not totally destroying or vastly destroying our soil microbes. You could say the same thing about fungicides and pesticides. Putting them constantly on our soil is going to kill our soil microbiome, and cover crops give us a way to grow fertility and have fertility without destroying our soil microbes. And we could add even others. The underlying premise of all of this is, instead of working against nature, work with it. It has billions of microbes hungry to turn organic matter into the perfect nutrients for our plants, and soil into a living sponge filled with humus, glomalin, large aggregates, and even larger pores, ample water, and all the other goodness our plants need. It has dozens, if not hundreds, of beneficial insects and other animals that naturally keep insect pests in balance just by living out their life cycles. So we may as well consciously work with them and even foster them. Plus, when we do, everything seems to benefit. And we use them in our gardens and farms, they give back to us tenfold, which to me is just a much wiser approach to living and getting the food we need to survive on this amazing place we call home. And even if you think that latter part is crazy talk, cover crops still greatly benefit our gardens and farms for 15 other reasons. Why not use them? Every day I look up at the garden, I see cover crops doing their job in building soil. And all I had to do was like walk around and sprinkle a few seeds on at the right time. That's it, 20 reasons of why to grow cover crops. Hope you've learned something. We'll have a upcoming episode on how to grow cover crops. Until next time, stay open to growing. You can find more on this topic and others on my website. I'll leave a link in the description below. Like this video if you liked it. Likes really help us out. Leave a comment or question below. I personally answer each one, and subscribe to get all of our future videos. And if social media is your jam, feel free to follow us on Twitter and Instagram for more green thumb gardening secrets, tricks, and tips. Just the tips.
Really no insect damage. Like we've put nothing on them.
20 reasons.
That's 25.
20. 20.
Or just how about no fingers?
20 reasons. That's it. 20 reasons